Clara Benton was the kind of assistant who could juggle 3 phone calls, a coffee spill, and a CEO's impossible schedule without breaking a sweat or brushing her hair. Her boss, Elijah Halden, was the kind of man who closed billion-dollar deals before breakfast and never cracked a smile unless it came with a profit margin. They had rules: keep it professional, keep it sharp, and absolutely keep it platonic. But one unexpected business trip, a luxurious hotel, and a single morning by the pool would send those rules crashing down and turn the CEO who didn't believe in distractions into a man who couldn't think about anything else. The elevator doors slid open with their usual soft chime, revealing the marble-floored heart of Halden and Company, where everything and everyone gleamed. Rows of pristine desks stretched toward the windows, framed by the morning skyline. People straightened their ties, adjusted their blouses, and checked their calendars with the urgency of those who knew the boss was somewhere nearby. At the center of it all, behind a glass wall and a door that might as well have been labeled "Here Be Dragons," sat Elijah Halden, CEO, billionaire, and the human embodiment of a perfectly pressed suit. Elijah was known for 2 things: turning a casual lunch with an investor into a signed multimillion-dollar deal, wearing an expression that suggested he'd never heard a joke in his life. That, at least, was the company rumor. Clara Benton knew better. She breezed past the receptionist with a coffee in one hand and a manila folder stuffed with reports in the other, her glasses slipping down her nose in their usual way. Her hair, which had been tied into a bun at 7:15 a.m., was already starting to escape in rebellious wisps. Her black pencil skirt was impeccable, but her shirt bore the faintest evidence of a coffee drip, hidden from most eyes but obvious to her own. When she reached Elijah's office, she didn't knock. She never did. "You have 5 minutes before your 9 o'clock meeting with the Anderson Group," she said, striding in. "I suggest you pretend to be a warm, approachable human being until then." Elijah glanced up from his laptop, his tie already perfectly in place. "I'll stick with efficient and intimidating, thank you." She set the folder on his desk. "Also acceptable. But then don't be surprised when Anderson chooses the other guy." He arched a brow. "The other guy is an amateur who thinks ROI is a radio station." Clara smirked. "And yet he'll walk in here with a smile. Try one. I promise it won't kill you." For a moment, just a flicker, his lips curved into the smallest smile. The kind you might miss if you blinked. Clara noticed. She always did. "Was that so hard?" she teased, dropping into the chair opposite him. "Don't get used to it," he replied, returning his gaze to the laptop. This was how it always was with them. Rapid-fire exchanges, a strange blend of exasperation and trust. Clara knew his schedule better than he did, could anticipate his moods from the tilt of his brow, and was one of the few people in the building who wasn't intimidated by him. Once, during a particularly tense board meeting, she'd passed him a sticky note that read, "Your face says you're planning someone's funeral. Maybe soften it?" He'd kept a straight face, but later she caught him chuckling in his office. Now, as she glanced at the clock on the wall, Clara rose to leave. "All right, Mr. Efficient and Intimidating. Time to charm some money out of the Andersons. I'll be in the corner with the notes in case you forget your lines." Elijah didn't look up, but there was that almost smile again. "If I need prompting, Benton, I'll just hire someone else." She turned at the door, giving him a bright, fake sweet smile. "Sure you will. And they'll last, what? 2 weeks. He didn't answer, but his eyes followed her until the door closed. And though neither of them would have admitted it out loud, both knew their strange, comfortable dance, all banter and perfectly controlled distance, was the most interesting part of their days. It was the kind of gray, drizzly Wednesday that made the entire city feel like it needed a nap. Clara sat at her desk, surrounded by a fortress of quarterly reports and a rapidly cooling mug of coffee. She was halfway through highlighting a particularly alarming drop in overseas revenue when the phone on her desk gave its sharp, 2-note buzz. Elijah's voice came through the intercom, smooth and uncompromising. "Clara. My office. Now. No, please. No, when you have a minute." just the verbal equivalent of a command stamped in bold letters. Clara sighed, capped her highlighter, and rose from her chair. She'd learned long ago that now meant now, not after finishing her sip of coffee or straightening her skirt. When she pushed open the glass door, Elijah was seated at his desk in that perfectly controlled way of his. Jacket on, tie straight, posture like the cover of a corporate magazine. He didn't look up right away, fingers flying over his keyboard. "You rang," she said, strolling in without waiting to be invited. "Yes," he replied, eyes still on the screen. "You're coming with me to Singapore next week." Clara stopped mid-step. "I'm sorry. I think you've mistaken me for your travel buddy. I'm your assistant. I stay here and make sure you don't double-book meetings or buy a shipping company on impulse." Elijah finally looked up. "It's a business trip. We're meeting with the Lee Group to secure their investment for the West Harbor project. You've managed every step of this deal. You'll be more useful there than here." Clara crossed her arms. "And here I thought you just liked the sound of my voice on airplanes." He didn't smile, but his eyes betrayed the tiniest glint of amusement. "You'll also make sure I don't say something that offends a board of billionaires. Which, in case you've forgotten, is one of your job descriptions. I don't remember signing up for International Travel Companion." "You didn't," he said simply. "And yet here we are." She narrowed her eyes. "Elijah. Benton." He leaned back in his chair, voice firm. "This isn't optional." There it was, the CEO voice. The one that closed deals, intimidated rivals, and made grown men revise their entire business strategies in 30 seconds. Clara had a rebuttal ready on the tip of her tongue, and then swallowed it. "Fine," she said, with exaggerated resignation. "But I'm not sharing a room with you, and I expect hazard pay if your schedule gives me jet lag." Elijah's mouth quirked, almost a smile. "Noted. Also," he hesitated just long enough for her to notice, "pack something appropriate for the hotel amenities." Clara blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, straightening his tie, "that I'm assuming you own something other than the oversized sweater you've worn 3 days this week." Her jaw dropped in mock offense. "This sweater is a classic. It's comfortable. It says, 'I'm competent and approachable.' It says, 'I've given up on life.'" She gasped theatrically. "One of these days, Halden, I'm going to teach you about feelings." "One of these days, Benton," he replied smoothly, "I'm going to teach you about wardrobe investment." She grabbed the folder he'd set aside for her, shaking her head as she turned to leave. "We'll see which happens first." As the door closed behind her, Elijah allowed himself the faintest, most private of smiles, the kind no one else would have believed he was capable of. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of boarding announcements, rolling suitcases, and travelers power-walking like Olympic athletes. Clara was trailing just a few paces behind Elijah, juggling her carry-on, laptop bag, and a coffee she had stubbornly refused to throw away even after passing security. Elijah, of course, carried a single, sleek leather briefcase and looked as if the entire travel process had been designed specifically for him. Crisp suit, polished shoes, not a wrinkle in sight. Clara had the distinct impression that if he were dropped into a tornado, he'd still come out on the other side with a perfect look. "You walk too fast," she called after him. "You walk too slow," he replied over his shoulder without breaking stride. "Some of us have shorter legs, Halden. Some of us prepare for travel by arriving on time." She caught up with him at the gate, panting slightly. "For the record, I was on time. You were early. There's a difference." He didn't respond. Instead, he handed his boarding pass to the attendant, who smiled a little too brightly at him before directing them toward the jet bridge. Clara caught the glance and rolled her eyes. When they stepped onto the plane, Clara froze. "This is first class," she said slowly, scanning the plush leather seats, the glass of champagne already waiting, the overhead bins that were actually empty. "Yes," Elijah replied simply, sliding his briefcase into the bin above his seat. "I was expecting. I don't know premium economy at best. You're traveling with me. I don't do premium economy." Clara sank into the wide seat next to him, running her hands along the armrest like she was petting a rare animal. This is absurd. I feel like a raccoon that accidentally wandered into a jewelry store. Elijah glanced at her. You clean up fine, Benton. Her head snapped toward him. Excuse me? That dress. It's better than the sweater. Clara blinked. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Are you feeling okay? Should I call a doctor? The corner of his mouth twitched. Don't ruin it. As the plane taxied, a flight attendant offered them a selection of menus. Clara studied hers as if decoding a foreign language. Why are there so many fork options for breakfast? Because it's breakfast in first class. This is why rich people are weird. He sipped his water. Weird or efficient? Both. They ordered. She went for pancakes with fresh berries, he for the omelet with smoked salmon. And for a while, the conversation shifted to the day's agenda. Clara took out her laptop, pulling up the presentation for their meeting in Singapore, while Elijah reviewed financial projections on his tablet. But in the quieter moments, when she was leaning over her keyboard, hair falling loose over one shoulder, Elijah found his gaze lingering a little too long. Without her glasses slipping down her nose, her eyes seemed sharper, more alive. He quickly looked back to his screen. Midway through the flight, turbulence hit. The plane jolted, and Clara's coffee sloshed dangerously close to her lap. Great, she muttered, gripping the armrest. Remind me why humans decided hurtling through the air in a giant metal tube was a good idea? Statistically, Elijah began, you're more likely to. If you say die in a car accident, I will pour this coffee in your lap. He glanced sideways at her, the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. Noted, when the turbulence passed, she relaxed back into her seat, arms crossed. You're terrible at in-flight reassurance. I'm excellent at everything else. She rolled her eyes but smiled. And he noticed. Somewhere over the Pacific, as the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers dozed, Clara fell asleep with her head tilted toward the window, the faintest crease between her brows smoothing out. Elijah, who never allowed himself distractions on work trips, found himself watching her for just a moment longer than necessary. And though he'd never admit it, the flight felt shorter than usual. The black sedan glided to a stop under the sweeping glass awning of the Marina Bay Lux, and the doorman opened the door with the kind of crisp precision that suggested he'd been trained by a military general. Clara stepped out and instantly forgot how to breathe. The entrance lobby wasn't just big. It was cathedral big. A vast expanse of polished marble stretched beneath her heels, reflecting a ceiling that soared into infinity. Above her hung a chandelier the size of her apartment, dripping with crystals that caught the sunlight pouring in from a wall of glass. In the center of the lobby, an arrangement of orchids and lilies rose from a fountain like a sculpture. This isn't a hotel, she whispered, turning in a slow circle. This is a Bond villain's lair if the Bond villain was really into interior design. Elijah handed the concierge his credit card without missing a beat. It's functional. Functional. Clara stared at him. You could fit my entire childhood home in the lobby. Twice. He smirked. Maybe 3 times. She shot him a look. Careful, Halden. I might get used to this. Their rooms were on the top floors, suites, naturally, each with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering sweep of the bay. Clara stepped inside hers and stopped dead. There was a plush king-sized bed draped in crisp white linens, a seating area with velvet armchairs, and a balcony with a view that made her dizzy. And then she noticed the bathroom. Oh my God, she muttered to herself. The bathtub wasn't just deep. It was practically Olympic-sized, set beside a wall of glass with a view of the city skyline. A tray already rested across it, stocked with bath salts, champagne glasses, and chocolates. Her phone buzzed. A message from Elijah. Dinner in my suite at 7. Bring your laptop. She typed back. You mean dinner meeting or dinner? His reply came almost instantly. Yes. At 7 sharp, Clara knocked on his door and was met with the warm scent of something delicious. Steak, she guessed, and the faintest trace of his cologne. His suite mirrored hers in layout, but was, well, Elijah-ified. His jacket was slung neatly over a chair, his laptop open on the dining table alongside an array of files, and a bottle of red wine breathing nearby. "You ordered room service," she said, setting her laptop down. "Fancy. Efficient," he corrected, pouring her a glass. "Saves us from dining with the investment crowd until we have to." They ate at the table, laptops open between plates of seared salmon, roasted vegetables, and, to her surprise, a basket of warm bread that she demolished with zero shame. "You're supposed to be working," Elijah teased, watching her butter another slice. "I am working," she said through a mouthful. "I'm working on keeping my blood sugar up so I can fix your disaster of a presentation." "It's not a disaster," he said automatically. She clicked through his slides and raised an eyebrow. "Slide 4 is in Comic Sans, Elijah." "It's not," he leaned over, frowned, and muttered. "That's unacceptable." She smirked. "Don't worry. I'll save you from public humiliation." They fell into their usual rhythm, she tweaking his slides and cutting unnecessary fluff, him pacing while dictating phrasing for the financial projections. But there was something softer about the atmosphere tonight. Maybe it was the city lights glittering through the windows. Maybe it was the wine loosening the edges of their conversation. At one point, she caught him watching her instead of the screen. "What?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just you're good at this." She arched an eyebrow. "Careful, Halden. Another compliment, and people will start thinking you like me." "Dangerous rumor," he said dryly, but his mouth curved just enough to make her wonder. They worked late, long after the plates had been cleared. When she finally closed her laptop, the clock read almost midnight. "Big day tomorrow," she said, gathering her things. Elijah nodded, walking her to the door. "Get some rest, Benton." And as she stepped into the hallway, she realized she was smiling. The kind of smile you don't notice until you catch yourself doing it. The morning sun spilled across the skyline, turning the bay into a sheet of molten gold. Clara had woken earlier than usual, partly because of the time difference and partly because her brain wouldn't stop running through tomorrow's presentation. She padded barefoot across the suite's marble floor, sliding open the balcony doors. The air was warm, fragrant with the faint scent of frangipani from the gardens below. She looked down at the hotel's infinity pool, a serene, sparkling blue ribbon perched so high it seemed to merge with the horizon. She hesitated only a second before making up her mind. 10 minutes later, she was wrapped in a hotel towel, hair tied loosely back, swimsuit under her cover-up. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple navy one-piece she'd owned for years. But it fit her comfortably, and that was all that mattered. The pool area was blissfully quiet, just a couple of guests lounging in the far corner. Clara dropped her towel on a chair, took off her glasses, and slid into the water. It was perfect, cool enough to refresh, warm enough to make her sigh as her shoulders dipped beneath the surface. She swam a few leisurely laps, letting her thoughts drift, her hair loosening from its tie until it floated around her like dark silk. She didn't notice him at first. Elijah had returned from his early morning run, earbuds still in, towels slung around his neck. He'd been heading for the elevators when movement by the pool caught his eye. At first, it was just someone swimming. Then she turned toward the sunlight, and the sight hit him like turbulence mid-flight. Clara, without her glasses, without her usual bun, without the brisk, guarded air she carried at the office. She emerged from the water slowly, smoothing her hair back, the curve of her smile relaxed in a way he'd never seen before. She climbed the steps, droplets trailing down her shoulders, catching the light. For one disarming second, Elijah forgot to breathe. She spotted him, froze for a moment, then smirked. Well, well. Halden, out in the wild. I didn't think you existed outside a suit." He took a step closer, pulling the earbuds from his ears. "I could say the same about you. I barely recognized you without all this." He gestured vaguely, as if all this meant glasses, messy hair, the armor she usually wore. "Careful," she said, wrapping the towel around herself. That sounded dangerously like a compliment. Maybe it was. His voice was quieter now. Clara tilted her head, studying him. "You okay, Halden? You look like you just saw the quarterly profits triple." Something like that, he said, but his eyes didn't leave hers. There was a beat of silence, not awkward, just charged. The kind of pause that didn't exist between them before. She broke it with a crooked smile. Come on, then. You going to join me, or are you too afraid of wrinkling your perfect reputation? I didn't bring swimwear, he admitted. Shame, she said, grabbing her towel tighter and brushing past him toward the elevators. Guess you'll just have to imagine what it's like to have fun. As she walked away, he caught himself watching longer than necessary. And in that instant, Elijah Halden knew something had shifted. The meeting with the Lee Group was a textbook success. Elijah was razor-sharp in the boardroom, all confidence and control, while Clara handled every technical glitch, every missing document, every subtle cultural courtesy with the ease of someone who had done her homework twice over. When the last handshake was made, Elijah simply said, "Good work," but his glance at her lingered just long enough to make her wonder if he meant more than just the presentation. That evening, Clara convinced him to skip the fancy hotel restaurants and head to a bustling night market she'd read about in the guidebook. You'll love it, she promised as they wove through the crowd. The air was thick with the smell of grilled skewers, sizzling noodles, and something smoky she couldn't identify. Elijah surveyed the chaos with mild suspicion. This doesn't seem sanitary. Relax, Halden. You won't die. She stopped at a stall where an elderly vendor was fanning skewers over hot coals. 2 of these, please. The vendor handed her 2 sticks of meat dripping with sauce. She bit into one and sighed happily. Oh, that's good. Here. She thrust the other at him. He hesitated. What is it? She grinned. Don't ask. Just try. To her surprise, he did. And after a moment's pause, that's actually incredible. See. You're welcome. They wandered for hours, tasting dumplings, shaved ice, and something neon green that Elijah flatly refused to eat. She bought a beaded bracelet from a street vendor, and when she tried to pay, Elijah had already slipped cash into the man's hand. Was that necessary? She asked. Yes, he said simply. On their 3rd day, they finished a morning investor briefing earlier than expected. Clara suggested they check out the gardens by the bay. Towering steel super trees covered in vines, walkways winding between them like something from a sci-fi movie. They wandered through the shaded paths until Clara realized Elijah was no longer beside her. Halden. A moment later, she spotted him a good 20 yards away, standing at a dead end, looking very much like a man who did not appreciate being lost. She strolled up, grinning. Did the big, scary CEO just get confused by the map? I was taking the scenic route, he said with perfect composure. Sure you were. That night, after a late working dinner, Clara found herself on the balcony of her suite, city lights glittering below. She was surprised when Elijah knocked once and stepped out to join her, 2 glasses of wine in hand. Couldn't sleep? She asked. He handed her a glass. Couldn't work anymore. They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Then, to her surprise, he started talking, not about quarterly targets or projections, but about the early days of the company, the pressure of following in his father's footsteps, the deals that had nearly sunk him before he'd even started. Clara listened, leaning against the railing, the breeze tugging at her hair. She told him about growing up in a cramped apartment above her mother's bookstore, how she'd learned to work hard because there wasn't any other option. It wasn't flirty, not exactly. But there was a weight to the conversation, the kind of truth you didn't share unless you trusted someone. At one point, he looked at her for a moment too long and said, almost to himself, "You're nothing like I expected when I hired you." She smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." It is. By the time the 4th day came, the lines between work trip and something else entirely had blurred. They still attended meetings, still made their schedules, still acted the part of CEO and assistant in public. But in private, there were looks that lingered, inside jokes that felt like secrets, and the unshakable sense that neither of them was ready for this trip to end. The rain was soft and warm as they left the hotel, the kind that clung to skin like a whisper. The bellhop loaded their luggage into the waiting car while Clara stood beneath the awning, watching the city shimmer in the early morning light. She felt the same odd ache she used to feel after a good book, the kind you didn't want to end. Elijah emerged from the lobby behind her, perfectly composed, as if the last 4 days had been nothing but standard business. But she noticed the smallest things, the way his glance lingered on her as she stepped into the car, the almost smile he didn't quite let settle on his face. The ride to the airport was quiet, but not the usual Elijah Halden quiet. This was softer, easier. He was checking his emails, yes, but he didn't bark instructions or ask her to open her laptop. Once, she caught him staring out the window like he was miles away from work entirely. On the plane, first class was hushed and dim, the kind of atmosphere designed for sleep. Clara tucked herself into her seat by the window, tucking a blanket around her legs. Elijah handed her a small white bag before stowing his briefcase. She frowned. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a small velvet box. Not jewelry, but a set of pearl and silver cufflinks shaped like tiny books. Her breath caught. "Where did you?" "Night market," he said simply, sitting down. "They reminded me of you." Clara blinked at him. "You bought me cufflinks. You always complain about how boring business attire is. Consider it an upgrade." She smirked. "This is dangerously close to thoughtful." "Don't spread it around," he said, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Not quite a joke, not quite serious. Midway through the flight, Clara dozed off, head resting lightly against the wall of the plane. Somewhere over the ocean, she shifted, her head falling against his shoulder. Elijah froze for a moment, unsure whether to wake her. Then he didn't. Instead, he sat there, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her arm brushing his. He kept his eyes on the darkened cabin, but in his chest something felt unreasonably unsteady. When she woke, she blinked, realized where she was, and sat up quickly. "Sorry. I didn't." "It's fine," he said. "Didn't mind." Her eyes searched his for a moment longer than necessary, then she leaned back in her seat. Neither of them spoke, but the silence felt different now, not awkward, not formal. It was full. As the plane began its descent, Clara glanced out the window at the city lights twinkling far below. "Back to reality," she murmured. Elijah's voice was low but clear. "Doesn't have to be exactly the same." She turned to look at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he offered the faintest of smiles, the kind he never wore in the office, and said, "You'll see." By the time the wheels touched down, Clara knew one thing for certain. Whatever had started in Singapore wasn't ending at baggage claim. Halden and Company's open-plan floor was always alive with the low hum of phones ringing, keyboards clacking, and whispered strategy sessions over half-drunk coffee. But on Monday morning, the buzz had a different edge. Clara felt it the moment she walked in. Conversations dipped for a fraction of a second as she passed. Someone from accounting glanced up, quickly looking back at her spreadsheet. 2 interns at the copier did that awkward half-smile people give when they're dying to ask a question but don't dare. Oh no, she thought. The rumor mill has clocked in early today. By the time she reached her desk, a message pinged on her computer. It was from Marcy in HR. "Saw you 2 come back from the airport together. First class?" Eyes spill. Clara rolled her eyes and closed the chat window. She was not feeding that fire. Elijah emerged from his office exactly at 9 a.m., as precise as a Swiss watch. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent and moved through the room with his usual calm authority. But when he stopped at her desk, something unusual happened. He set down a cardboard cup. "Double shot latte," he said. "Extra cinnamon." Clara blinked at the cup, then at him. "You remembered my coffee order?" "I have an excellent memory for important details." From the nearby desks, heads subtly turned. Clara leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You know this will fuel at least 3 conspiracy theories before lunch, right?" "Let them speculate," Elijah said, straight-faced, before walking back into his office. Clara stared after him, muttering under her breath, "And you claim I'm the troublemaker." By mid-morning, the whispers had grown legs. Clara caught bits of them in the break room. Sat next to each other the whole flight. Apparently stayed in suites. First name basis now. She drowned it out by returning to her desk and diving into the Lee Group post-meeting reports. The work was enough to distract her, until Elijah appeared in the doorway of her cubicle. "We're reviewing the new harbor project designs in the boardroom. You're coming." She glanced at the pile of paperwork on her desk. "And if I say I'm swamped, you'll still come." She grabbed her notebook, muttering, "One of these days, Halden." In the boardroom, she sat to his right, taking notes as the design team laid out sleek renderings of the project. At one point, she caught Elijah watching her instead of the slides. "What?" she whispered, without looking up from her notepad. "Nothing," he said, but the faint smirk tugging at his mouth said otherwise. She shook her head, biting back a smile. This is dangerous territory, she thought. That afternoon, she returned from a quick lunch break to find a small paper bag on her desk. Inside was a chocolate croissant from the bakery across the street, the one that sold out by 9:30 every morning. There was no note, but she didn't need one. When she passed Elijah's office a few minutes later, he didn't look up from his laptop, but the corner of his mouth curved slightly. By the end of the day, Clara knew two things for certain. The office gossip wasn't going to die down anytime soon. She didn't mind nearly as much as she should have. It started with an email. Subject line: dinner. 7:30, tonight. No please, no explanation, no corporate jargon. Just an address to a restaurant Clara had to Google. It turned out to be the kind of place that didn't list prices on its menu and had a 6-week waiting list for normal people. She debated ignoring it. She'd already planned to spend the night in sweatpants with a bowl of pasta. But curiosity won. Or maybe it wasn't curiosity. Maybe it was that half smile he'd given her yesterday when he'd dropped off her coffee. When she arrived, the restaurant was all low lighting, amber glow from candles, and the muted hum of conversations spoken in the kind of voices that never had to shout to be heard. She paused just inside the door, scanning the tables until she spotted him. Elijah was already seated, jacket perfectly tailored, tie loosened just enough to look intentional. He stood when he saw her, his eyes sweeping over her in a way that made her suddenly aware of every choice she'd made about her dress, her hair, even her lipstick. "You clean up well, Benton," he said as she sat down. She arched a brow. "Careful, Halden. That's 2 compliments in as many weeks. People will talk. They already are." The waiter appeared, bringing a bottle of wine Elijah had clearly already chosen. They ordered without much fuss. She went for the seared scallops, he for the fillet, and when the wine was poured, she raised her glass. "To business?" she teased. He clinked his glass lightly against hers. "Not tonight." They talked. Really talked. Not about quarterly projections or investor schedules, but about the books that had stuck with them for years, the places they wanted to see before they were old, the stupid little mistakes that had haunted them far longer than they should have. She told him about the time she'd accidentally called her high school English teacher, Mom, in front of the entire class. He laughed, actually laughed, head tipping back just enough for her to notice how rare it was for him to look unguarded. He told her about the time, early in his career, he'd tried to impress a client by cooking dinner and ended up setting off the building's fire alarm. Clara nearly spit out her wine. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, she caught herself leaning forward, elbows on the table, smiling in a way she didn't bother to hide. Elijah's gaze dropped briefly to her hands, then back to her face. "You know," he said, voice lower now, "I think we've been negotiating the wrong deal all along." "Oh," she asked, tilting her head. "And what's the right one?" He let a small pause stretch between them, as if weighing his words. Then his hand brushed hers, deliberate, light, but enough to send a jolt up her arm. "A partnership. Long-term. No contracts, except maybe the unwritten kind." Her lips curved. "Sounds risky. High risk. High reward." She leaned back slightly, enjoying the rare sight of him letting the mask slip. "Well, I'm open to negotiations." They lingered after dessert, long after the plates had been cleared, the conversation dipping into quieter territory. By the time they left, the air outside was cool, and Elijah walked her to a waiting car without asking where she was headed, as if he already knew. And maybe he did, because when she glanced back at him from the car window, his expression wasn't the CEO face she knew so well. It was something else entirely. The next morning, Clara was halfway through her first coffee when she realized she'd been smiling at her inbox for a solid 3 minutes. It wasn't because of the emails, a sea of budget updates and meeting invites, but because she could still hear Elijah's voice from last night, low and unguarded, asking her about the right deal. She shut her laptop with a soft thunk and told herself to get it together. Unfortunately, Halden and Company wasn't going to make that easy. By 10 a.m., the whispers had tripled. It didn't help that Elijah called her into his office twice in an hour for things that easily could have been handled over email. Each time, she emerged to find curious eyes tracking her back to her desk. At lunch, Marcy from HR slid into the seat across from her in the break room. "You've been glowing lately." "It's called getting enough sleep," Clara said, biting into her sandwich. "MHM. And it has nothing to do with certain billionaire CEOs inviting you to dinner." Clara nearly choked. "Do you people have a surveillance team I don't know about?" Marcy just smirked. "Just saying. If I worked that close to him, I'd be glowing too." Later that afternoon, Clara found herself in the elevator with Elijah, just the two of them. The doors slid shut, and the hum of the building faded. "Everyone's talking," she said without looking at him. "I'm aware. You don't seem concerned." "I'm not," he replied. Then, after a pause, "Are you?" She hesitated. "Not exactly. But we should probably decide where the line is." Elijah's eyes stayed on hers. "And what if I'm not interested in keeping it where it's been?" The elevator dinged, the doors opened, and he stepped out without waiting for her answer. Clara stood frozen for a beat before following, her pulse doing entirely unnecessary gymnastics. It happened on a Friday night, 2 weeks later. The office had emptied, the usual clatter replaced by the low hum of the cleaning crew. Clara was still at her desk, wrapping up edits on the West Harbor project files, when Elijah appeared in her doorway. "Hungry?" he asked. She glanced at the clock. "It's almost 9. That's not an answer." She sighed, saving her work. "Starving." They ended up at a tiny bistro around the corner, the kind of place where the owner greeted Elijah like an old friend and set them at a corner table without asking. The food was simple, pasta, bread, wine, but the atmosphere was warm, cozy, almost conspiratorial. Halfway through the meal, Elijah set his fork down and leaned in slightly. "Benton, I'm tired of pretending this is just work." Clara's heart stuttered. "And what exactly is this?" "Something I want to see where it goes," he said plainly. "With you." She stared at him, trying to read every flicker in his expression. "You realize we work together. People will talk," he finished. "Let them. I'd rather deal with gossip than pretend I don't want this." Her lips curved slowly. "You're very sure of yourself." "I have good instincts," he said, "especially about deals worth making." There was a beat of silence before she said, "And if I say yes?" His mouth quirked into the faintest smile. "Then the deal is sealed." She leaned back, swirling her wine. "I'm open to negotiations, but I should warn you, I drive a hard bargain." "I'm counting on it." They lingered long after their plates were cleared, and when they finally stepped out into the cool night air, Elijah's hand brushed hers, tentative, deliberate, before she laced her fingers with his. For once, there were no contracts, no schedules, no deadlines. Just a quiet agreement, signed not in ink, but in the soft press of her palm against his. And for both of them, that was binding enough. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.